Hello, students. Today's video lecture is an introduction to the digestive system. We're also going to dive into the structures of the mouth and the pharynx. So let's get started. So I wanted to start by talking about the functions of the digestive system, where we're going to try to put them in order here. We know digestive system has something to do with eating, and so the first function of the digestive system is that it gives us a place to put the food into our bodies, and we call that ingestion. Ingestion. We put the food into our body. So it goes in. The second step is that we have to break that food down, those big chunks of food that we chew up and swallow. We have to break it down into the nutrients, into a usable size that we can actually absorb. So breaking that down is called digestion. We're going to break the food down into usable sized pieces. We're going to break our big carbohydrates down into sugars. We're going to break our proteins into amino acids, and we're going to break our fats down into fatty acids and triglycerides. So things we can actually use. Super small. The third part of the puzzle is that once we've broken these food pieces down into a usable size, into like molecules, we absorb those molecules right through the wall of the blood vessel and right into the bloodstream. So the reason why we have to eat in the first place is because our cells need the nutrients. They need the glucose. They need the amino acids. They need those little pieces to do what they do that keeps us alive. And so the reason why we have to eat food is to break it down into usable pieces so we can absorb those usable pieces we call nutrients into the blood, and then the blood takes it all over the body. The last part is not the most pleasant to talk about, but it is a vital part of this process, and that is removal of solid waste. That solid waste I'm talking about is poop. And instead of saying poop for these video lectures, I'm going to call it its real name, which is feces. So the removal of solid waste, the act of removing it, aka pooping, is called defecation. Waste itself is feces, and the act of getting it out of the body is defecation. So that is part of the process, because we do ingest food that we can't digest. So then we don't absorb anything from it, and we have to get rid of it. So those are our 4 functions. All right, our next topic of conversation is what organs make up the digestive system. And we can break those organs down into 2 main groups. We have what's pictured below, actually, is our food tube. The tube that food travels through and that we break it down inside of, and we absorb the nutrients from it, and then we defecate at the end. That food tube is called the alimentary canal. That's a very anatomical way to say it, the alimentary canal. You may also hear people call it the gastrointestinal tract. And sometimes gastrointestinal, which means stomach, gastro, and intestines, is abbreviated GI. I wonder why people would abbreviate that word. So the gastrointestinal or GI tract. Technically, that doesn't include anything above the stomach, and we know that there's this tube and then the mouth area. So alimentary canal is actually a little bit better term, but it's not as common. So that's our food tube. But then we have other organs that help the digestion occur. No food actually goes into them. They're just there along the way to assist in this process, and those are called the accessory organs. So if we take a look at the digestive system, you can see the beginning is in the mouth with the teeth, and then we have the tube that the food travels down as it goes to our stomach, and then we've got all these intestines, and obviously we know this is the way out down here. But if we get rid of all those bones, we see that there's this, and this little green thing here, and this in the back. No food goes into those parts, the liver, the gallbladder, and the pancreas. No food goes in there. But what are they doing in this system? They're helping with the digestion. They make specific chemicals that help with digestion. So those helping organs are called accessory organs. So we have the actual pathway that food travels called the gastrointestinal tract or alimentary canal. And then we've got the accessory organs that help us along the way, but no food actually enters them. They just help by putting chemicals into the food tube. Okay, so we're going to concentrate on our food tube for quite some time. And below here is a picture of number 1. That's the alimentary canal. So we're going to go ahead and put in our labels along the way. Essentially, food enters through the mouth and it exits the anal canal. The actual opening is the anus. But where does it go along the way? Let's start at the beginning. So everybody knows we put food into our mouth. The space inside the mouth is called the oral cavity. And then as the food passes away from our mouth, it goes into our throat area, which we call the pharynx. Okay, and that is a tube for food and air. The air tube goes towards the front of the body. The food tube continues down, and that is known as the esophagus. So really, it's just a passageway from the mouth pharynx area, passageway down to, that's the stomach there. Notice the stomach is more of a pouchy size. And then the stomach dumps its food into the thinner of the 2 tubes that are left, the small intestine. And the small intestine turns into a larger diameter tube here. That's the large intestine. And then finally, the last part of the large intestine is where the feces is stored before it's removed. This part's called the rectum. And then the last part of the tube, the very last little inch, is the anal canal. Okay, and the opening is the anus. That's the actual opening. So all these parts that we've mentioned are part of the alimentary canal. And food will pass through this and be changed, right? Dramatically as it passes through. It goes in as a cheeseburger and it comes out as feces. That's a pretty magical transformation. We're going to learn a little bit about it. Okay, so the alimentary canal, let's start at the beginning with the mouth area. Here's a lovely image of the mouth. I know you recognize a lot of these structures, so let's start with something that you do recognize. Right here, these are teeth. We use the teeth obviously to chew, to bite the food, and to chew, and chewing is also known as mastication. We have heard that word before when we talked about the muscles that help in mastication. Chewing is a form of digestion, and it's called mechanical digestion because we're breaking the food down into smaller pieces. We're not really changing it with chemicals yet, but we're taking large bits of food and physically tearing it or breaking it into smaller bits. So that's known as mechanical digestion because it breaks food down physically. Next, we have the tongue. And we know the tongue is a muscular organ. It's actually made of skeletal muscle. That's why we can control it. It's covered in specialized nerve cells called taste buds. And the taste buds obviously allow us to taste our food. But why do we need to taste our food? What's so important about being able to taste our food? It makes eating pleasurable. No one wants to eat something that doesn't taste good. And so the fact that we have taste buds makes eating pleasurable. Underneath the tongue, you can see this tongue is kind of lifted up here. Underneath is a connector that connects the tongue to the floor of the oral cavity, the space inside the mouth being the oral cavity. And that connector is called the lingual frenulum. Lingual is a word that means tongue, and a connective tissue that connects the tongue to the floor of the oral cavity. Sometimes people are born with the lingual frenulum too connecting, and they have what's called being tongue-tied, so they actually have to cut the lingual frenulum so their tongue can move properly. As we progress towards the top of the mouth, the roof of the mouth, we're dividing the roof of the mouth into 2 sections. The more anterior section towards the front is called the hard palate. And we call it the hard palate because it's supported by bone. The maxilla, or the upper jaw, is above this epithelial tissue here on the roof of the mouth. And this is separating your oral cavity in your mouth from the nasal cavity in the nose. As we move backwards towards the back of the roof of the mouth, that bone stops, but that soft tissue continues. And so we have part of our palate here that's not supported by bone, so we call that the soft palate. And the soft palate starts to arch downward. I'll see if I can show you on the anatomy app here. It starts to bend downward. Now, this is kind of gross because I got rid of the skeleton. So watch. This is the nasal cavity here. But if we look at the back of the palate, now this is the nose area. Let's see if I can get in there. I'm going to eliminate some of these items. Here's the tongue. And if I click on this area, you'll see it starts to kind of arch downward a little bit. So we want food, obviously, to go in this direction. So we're going to start to guide it with the soft palate. It's soft because it is not supported by bone, and it separates the oral cavity in the mouth from where the nose turns into the throat. And where the nose turns into the throat, we call that area the nasopharynx. Off the back of the soft palate, I'm sure you've seen this in your own mouth, is this little dangly appendage known as the uvula. Uvula, the soft appendage hanging down off the soft palate. When you swallow, it blocks food from entering your nasopharynx. We do not want food going up into our nose throat. And so the uvula, the little punching bag, kind of keeps it heading in this direction. Finally, at the bottom it says, can you find the tonsils? The visible ones are called the palatine tonsils. You've probably seen this in your mouth before. Maybe you didn't know what it was, but right here, I'm going to color these in with my highlighter tool. Here, lumpy, bumpy structures, and here, those are the palatine tonsils. They're the tonsils associated with the palate, kind of where the soft palate comes down to the side here. So those are called palatine tonsils. Are they part of the digestive system? The answer is no. They're part of the lymphatic system. So why do we need tonsils in our mouth if they're not part of the digestive system? Well, the food that we eat passes by these tonsils, and actually there's tonsils at the very base of the tongue called the lingual tonsils, and then there's some up in the nasopharynx called the adenoids. So we have some up here past where we can see, and some down here past where we can see. And this ring shape is created by all these tonsils. So as our food goes past, we have structures that help fight off any bacteria that might be in the food. And those are the structures of the oral cavity. I also need to talk to you about the salivary glands. They're not technically in the oral cavity, but they do surround the oral cavity. I'm going to go ahead and highlight my salivary glands. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So they're not in the actual oral cavity, but they surround the oral cavity, and you can see pretty clearly here there's a little tube that takes the saliva from the salivary gland and puts it into the oral cavity. So if we tip under here, you can see here's this tube here that leads in, and then this tube here, and those will lead into underneath the tongue. So salivary glands are an important part of structures that surround the oral cavity. So let's get our bearings in terms of direction. Here's our directional compass. This way is superior or up, inferior or down. Towards the front of the body is anterior, and posterior towards the back. So we have 3 pairs of salivary glands, 3 on the right side of the face and 3 on the left side of the face, and they're in pairs. So we'll talk about them in terms of pairs. So salivary glands, as you may know, produce a slimy fluid called saliva. So a lot of people want to call these salivatory glands. I'm not sure where that comes from, but just make the word saliva and then put an RY, salivary glands. And saliva is primarily 2 parts. It is mucus. Mucus is mostly water, but it's made slimy by this protein that we emit called mucin. So when mucin mixes with water, it becomes mucus. Okay, so most of our saliva is mucus. Then we actually have an enzyme in the saliva known as salivary amylase. First off, if you see ASE at the end of a word and it's a biology word, it's probably an enzyme. An enzyme is a chemical that helps to make another chemical reaction happen without getting used up. So they're really helpful in allowing us to do chemical reactions. So salivary amylase is an enzyme that starts to break down carbohydrates that we have eaten. Let's take a minute and think about that. When you eat a piece of candy and it's sugar, it dissolves in your mouth. When you eat a cracker, if you held that cracker in your mouth, it would end up dissolving. Both of those are carbohydrates. If you held a piece of beef jerky in your mouth, it would not go anywhere. You could keep that thing in your mouth all day because beef jerky is not a carbohydrate. Or if for some reason you had a big chunk of fat from a piece of meat that you decided to tuck into your cheek, it would still be there at the end of the day. Because fat is not a carbohydrate. So anything that's carbohydrates will actually end up being broken down in your mouth because your saliva has an enzyme in it that breaks down anything carbohydrate. So that's like breads, pasta, cereals, rice, and then of course anything sugary. So in the notes it says whenever you add an enzyme to food, it breaks it down into smaller pieces. That is a form of, we're adding a chemical to break our food into smaller pieces. That's chemical digestion. And let's go ahead and label our salivary glands in the diagram. This first one is the biggest one, and we notice it's hanging out here by the outside of the face, right in front of the ear. If I add the face in, see it's right by the ear. Okay, so in this vicinity here is a big one, and that's called the parotid gland. These are all salivary glands. We have two that kind of hang out underneath the tongue. That's what I'm trying to draw there is the tongue. Artist I am not. So under the tongue, we have the sublingual gland. Now that literally means under the tongue. Under, sublingual tongue. And then the last one is the submandibular, which means under the mandible. And you may recall that the mandible is the lower jaw. So right where the corner of the jaw is, this submandibular is underneath it. The main way I tell students to remember which one's which, they're both under, so we're going to look for the word sub to know they're under the tongue, and then L comes before M in the alphabet and in our face. So let's take a look at our app. This is the parotid salivary gland. And under here, if I tip, here's the sublingual, and over here, see how it's more anterior towards the front of the face? And submandibular is right underneath that corner of the jaw. Again, over here, submandibular. So 6 salivary glands in all, 3 pairs. Okay, the last topic for today's video is the pharynx. So let me just remind you that we just finished discussing the structures of the oral cavity, the teeth, the tongue, the uvula, the hard, soft palate, etc. And then we moved to the salivary glands that are outside of this area, and now we're going to land in the pharynx. So we chew up our food, and then the next step is to swallow it. After your food has been chewed, okay, masticated, the ball of chewed food is a bolus. So that's the food that we don't want to see when you're chewing it. No one wants to see your chewed food, which is why you should chew with your mouth closed. We don't want to see your bolus, so keep it to yourself. So once your food's been chewed and it's now a bolus, you are ready to swallow it. There are muscles all around your pharynx or throat, right? Keep in mind, pharynx is just a fancy way to say throat that allow you to swallow your food. And the actual act of swallowing is called deglutition. Deglutition is swallowing the food. Now, there are 3 options. So let's go back to the app and we can follow the ways that food could potentially go. So let's put in our notes what our pathways are. Food could go up to the nose throat, which we know leads to the nasal cavity. That's bad. We don't want that. It could go into the airway, in which case that's called choking. and potentially could lead to death. It could go into the esophagus, the actual food tube that it's supposed to go in. So that's our happy face. That's the direction we want it to go. So as we swallow, two different things happen to ensure that food goes in the right direction. We need to eliminate the pathways that are undesirable. The uvula blocks this first pathway. The little punching bag flattens out and moves like sort of backwards and up to block the nasopharynx. It's not foolproof. If you've ever shot milk out of your nose, or soda is the worst, you know it sometimes happens. However, most of the time, it works. So we took care of that. Pathway number 2, into the airway. This could be deadly. We need a fail-safe for that, and we do have one. It's called the epiglottis. This word means upon the surface, and glottis is the opening between the vocal cords. So essentially your airway in your voice box section. So this is a piece of flexible cartilage that covers over your airway. Okay, if I delete this section right here, which is sort of where the divide happens between air and food, and I look inside there, there is this structure right here. It sort of represents the epiglottis. So epiglottis blocks food from entering the airway. So it prevents choking. And I want to show you a quick animation of the epiglottis here. It's like, it reminds me of a trash can lid, the kind that you step on the little pedal and the trash can lid goes up, and then when you lift off the pedal, it goes down, except it works opposite. It's open most of the time and then closes when we swallow. All right, so we're going to look at normal physiology here. So we've got the tongue, and here's the nasal cavity, here's the pharynx. And this part right here, see the little rings at the bottom? That's the trachea. We don't want food there. We do want it to go back into this tube, which is mostly collapsed most of the time. That's the esophagus. So when we breathe, you can breathe in your nose, you can breathe in your mouth. They just showed that, and that goes into the airway. And then exhalation, you can see. Those are the vocal cords right there vibrating. So during a normal swallowing action, the larynx is going to move upwards, and this little flap right here is going to move downwards and close the opening to the airway. Okay, watch very carefully. So you see right now I have the epiglottis is closed. That's this piece. This is the bolus, the chewed food, and this is the airway. So that chewed food cannot get past the epiglottis and get into the airway. It can only go into the esophagus. So remember, during this time period, you cannot breathe. So if you get something stuck in your throat and the epiglottis is closed, you still can't breathe. The food doesn't actually have to even go in there and get stuck. It just has to get stuck right here. So watch as the bolus passes by the epiglottis and the airway and then down into the esophagus. Then when you breathe again, the epiglottis opens up and you can breathe out. So breathing in, swallowing closes the epiglottis, food moves into the esophagus, and then in order to breathe out, you need to open the epiglottis and breathe out again. So there's a little animation of the epiglottis. Number 3, when both of these structures work properly, the only other route, we blocked the nose, we blocked the airway, the only other route is the right way, which is the esophagus. All right, so let's take a minute and try to label this diagram here. I will get you started with number 1 being the nasal cavity, and number 3 being the oral cavity. And I'm going to put number 10 as the pharynx, and I'll give you some options for the rest.